The gate agent's voice was pleasant. That was the part Nathaniel Cross would remember longest. Not the words, but the register. Friendly. Practiced. The tone of someone who had learned to deliver an injustice with the cadence of customer service. "Sir, we're going to need to move you to economy for this flight." Nathaniel looked up from his boarding pass. Seat 1A. Paid in full. Booked 11 days ago. Around him, the jetway hummed and the line moved and 43 other passengers shuffled past without meeting his eyes. The gate agent's smile didn't waver. "We've had a seating issue, and we need your seat for another passenger." She didn't look at the other passenger. She didn't have to. He was already standing behind her, white, 60-ish, impatient, holding a boarding pass for a seat in row 14. Nathaniel's jaw tightened. His briefcase contained a signed term sheet for a $150 million acquisition he was flying to Chicago to finalize. The people at the other end of that flight had no idea they were about to lose the deal. Neither did the gate agent, and neither did the man now settling into seat 1A as the aircraft door closed, and Nathaniel Cross, CEO, sat in 32 billion with his laptop open and his mind already on the call he was about to make. 7 years earlier, this is where it starts. Nathaniel Cross grew up in Birmingham, Alabama, in a house on 4th Avenue North where his grandmother, Celestine, had lived for 40 years and intended to die in, which she eventually did, at 89, with her affairs in order and her mind intact and her opinion about most things still sharp enough to cut. His mother, Patricia, taught 4th grade at a Title I elementary school for 31 years. His father, Robert, worked in quality control at a steel processing plant 3rd shift for 22 years before the plant closed and took the pension with it when Nathaniel was 16. That was the year Nathaniel understood, concretely and permanently, that the difference between financial security and financial catastrophe was thinner than anyone who had only ever known security could imagine. He carried that understanding with him the way some people carry a scar, not visible to everyone, but always there, shaping how he moved through rooms. He got into Auburn on academic scholarship, double major in economics and accounting, graduated in 3.5 years, worked 2 part-time jobs the whole time, sent money home when he could, got an MBA from Emory at 24, top of his program, recruited by 2 private equity firms and a Big 4 consultancy in the same semester. He took the PE firm because PE was where you learned what companies were actually worth and why, and Nathaniel Cross had decided at 16, in the year his father's pension disappeared, that he was going to understand the machinery of value creation in a way that nothing could take from him. He was good at it, not in the way of someone who has studied a technique and applies it correctly, but in the way of someone who sees the underlying structure of a situation, who looks at a company and perceives its actual mechanics the way a doctor perceives a body, with diagnostic clarity, finding the point of leverage before anyone else in the room has named the problem. His partners noticed. He made partner at 31, which was fast. He left to start Cross Capital at 34, which was faster. Cross Capital, by the time Nathaniel was 41, managed a portfolio of 7 operational companies across logistics, healthcare, technology, and commercial services, with a combined enterprise value approaching $400 million. His name was not on the side of any buildings. He did not give interviews. He ran a company of 41 people who were, by any measure, excellent at their work, and he ran it with the quiet intensity of a man who had spent his career being underestimated and had learned to treat that as an operational advantage. The acquisition he was flying to finalize was Meridian Logistics Solutions, a Chicago-based third-party logistics firm with 82 employees, 14 carrier contracts, and an owner, a man named Harold Beck, who had spent 3 years building something good and had called Cross Capital 8 months ago because he wanted to sell to someone who would protect what he'd built rather than strip it. Nathaniel had spent 8 months doing what he always did, understanding the business completely before committing to it. Harold Beck had spent 8 months watching Nathaniel's process and growing, slowly and somewhat to his own surprise, into the conviction that he'd found the right buyer. The term sheet in Nathaniel's briefcase was signed. The closing dinner was scheduled for that evening. The wire was staged. It was a $600 first-class ticket on a 2-hour flight. He did not get his seat. The gate agent's name was Jennifer Moss. She had worked for Prestige Airways for 6 years, liked her job generally, managed difficult situations with the trained pleasantness her supervisors rewarded, and her colleagues admired. She had a 4-year-old and a 7-year-old and a commute of 40 minutes and a genuinely decent professional record and no consciousness whatsoever of what she was about to do. She was not a malicious person. That is worth saying plainly, because what happened was not a malicious act. It was something more insidious than malice. It was an assumption so deeply grooved that it operated without any consultation with conscience at all. The kind of assumption that lives in the space below deliberation, that makes decisions before the mind has been consulted, that looks from the outside like instinct and from the inside feels like nothing at all because it has never once been interrupted by consequence. The other passenger was a man named Gerald Frayne, 62, VP of Regional Sales at a packaging company, traveling on a companion upgrade that had been applied to a basic economy fare booked 3 days prior. His upgrade had been confirmed, but his seat had not been specifically assigned, and there had been an overbooking in business class, and the operational resolution was to displace someone from first class. And Jennifer had looked at the first class manifest. 9 passengers, 2 of them with elite status, 3 booked on corporate accounts, and made a choice in under 10 seconds that she would not have been able to fully articulate if asked. She was not asked. That was how these things usually worked. Gerald Frayne settled into seat 1A with the incurious ease of a man who considered premium upgrades a natural extension of his professional standing. He did not ask why the seat was available. He did not look toward the back of the aircraft. He accepted a glass of water and opened the in-flight magazine and was already somewhere else by the time the door closed. Nathaniel found 32 billion and sat down with the compressed stillness of a man who is doing the internal work of deciding what this moment means and what comes next, and what it costs him to answer. Those questions, honestly, he had been flying long enough, had been black in America long enough, to have a complete and accurate understanding of what had just happened to him. He did not need to speculate. He had sat in this seat before, different flight numbers, different gate agents, different years, the same pleasantness in the tone of the person delivering the instruction that communicated, clearly and without ever saying so, that his presence in a certain space was conditional in a way that other people's was not. The form changed. The mechanism did not. What was different this time was what was in his briefcase. He sat for a moment with his hands on his knees and let himself feel what he felt, completely and without performance, because he had learned that the only way to move through that feeling, rather than carry it indefinitely, was to look at it directly. He felt the specific, familiar anger of a man who has done everything correctly, paid the correct amount, held the correct ticket, arrived at the correct time, and been moved anyway. He felt it fully. Then he opened his laptop, found Harold Beck's number, opened a new email, and wrote one sentence, "Harold, I need to call you before the dinner tonight. Something came up on my end that I want to walk you through." He sent it, closed the laptop, looked at the seat back in front of him for a moment, the beige upholstery of a middle seat in economy class on a 2-hour flight, unremarkable in every way except its location in his life right now. Then he opened the laptop again and made the call. Harold Beck picked up on the second ring. He was in his office in Chicago's West Loop, eating a sandwich at his desk, 2 hours before a closing dinner he had spent 3 days looking forward to. The deal had been 8 months of careful negotiation, back and forth on warranty provisions and earn-out structures and transition agreements, and Harold was the kind of man who didn't allow himself to feel relieved until a thing was actually done. He was almost done. Tonight was almost done. His voice was easy. "Nathaniel, you in the air?" "I am," Nathaniel said. His voice was equally easy. This was not a conversation that required elevation. "I want to tell you what happened at the airport this morning, because I think you should know, and because it's going to affect how we proceed," he told Harold briefly and without embellishment what had happened at the gate. The boarding pass. Seat 1A. The gate agent's pleasant voice. The man now sitting in his seat. Economy class, middle seat, row 32. A $600 first-class ticket unredeemed. Harold was quiet for a moment. Then, "Nathaniel, I know," Nathaniel said. "I want to be clear that I'm not calling because I need anything from you. I'm calling because I've spent 8 months making sure you and I understand each other about what kind of company we both want to build after this deal closes. And before we sign the final documents tonight, I need you to know the kind of thing that happens to me in the world. because it will happen to people in our company. It may already be happening, and I need to know we agree about what that means for how we operate. On the ground in Chicago, Harold Beck set down his sandwich and did something that not everyone in his position would have done. He actually thought about it, not processed it for optics, not calculated the correct response. He sat at his desk in the West Loop and applied what he'd just heard to the 47 people who worked for him in that building. To Dana, who ran carrier relationships and was the most competent person on his team, and to Marcus in compliance, who had told Harold twice in the past year about situations at customer sites that Harold had heard and then not fully sat with. He thought about those moments now, with the specific discomfort of someone connecting dots they had been avoiding connecting. "We agree," Harold said. "Absolutely, and without qualification. And I owe some people some conversations I haven't had." "That's a good place to start," Nathaniel said. "Dinner at 7. I'll be there." He closed the laptop. The flight was 2 hours. He spent 40 minutes on the financial model, found nothing new, closed it, looked out the window at weather building over Indiana, a gray shelf of cloud, the specific flatness of the Midwest before a storm. Thought about his father, Robert, driving home from third shift at the steel plant in winter dark, careful and quiet so as not to wake anyone. 22 years of that, a pension that was supposed to be a foundation and then wasn't. The plane descended into O'Hare. Nathaniel picked up his briefcase and walked off the plane, through the jetway into the terminal. He moved through it the way he moved through every room, with attention, without hurry, taking in the geometry of the space and the people in it and the specific relationship between where he was and where he needed to be. He hailed a rideshare and called Prestige Airways' customer relations line from the back seat. He called Prestige Airways' customer relations line from the rideshare to the hotel, not from anger, from the same precision with which he did everything. He spoke to a representative, then a supervisor, then, after a 15-minute hold that he used to review the wire transfer instructions, a director of customer experience named Rachel Torres, who listened to the account of what had happened with the particular quiet of someone who understood she was receiving something serious. He gave her the flight number, the gate agent's name, the seat number he had paid for, and the seat number he had been moved to. He gave her Gerald Frayn's name, which he had obtained from the gate manifest before boarding because he had known, even then, that this was a conversation that would happen. He was precise. He did not raise his voice. He spoke at the pace of someone dictating into a record they intend to be read later. He did not use the word discrimination, though they both knew which word was absent and why it was absent, and what its absence meant, the way a room can be defined by the object that isn't in it. Rachel Torres said she would investigate and call him back within 24 hours. He said thank you. He meant it. And he meant something else by it too. The particular thanks of someone who knows that 24 hours is the answer people give when they intend to make something go away, and who has already decided that what he needs is not the 24-hour answer. He went to the closing dinner. Harold Beck was standing at the door of the restaurant when Nathaniel arrived, which Nathaniel noted he had not had to wait, had not been left to stand in a lobby while someone finished something more important. Harold had been there first. That mattered. Small things always did. They had dinner. They talked about the company, the team, the transition timeline. Harold talked about two of his senior employees, a woman named Dana who ran carrier relationships, and a man named Torres who handled compliance, and spoke about them the way people speak about people they are genuinely worried about during a transition. Nathaniel said he'd already been planning to ask about Dana specifically because the carrier relationship infrastructure was the most irreplaceable part of what he was acquiring. Harold's face changed in a particular way when he said that. Not surprised exactly, more like confirmed. The documents were signed at 10:15. The wire transferred the following morning. Prestige Airways completed its investigation 9 days later. The findings confirmed what Nathaniel had described: a first-class seat, paid in full, reallocated to accommodate a standby upgrade, with the selection of the displaced passenger made in a manner the investigation described, with careful institutional language, as not consistent with the airline's stated non-discrimination policies. Jennifer Moss received a formal reprimand and mandatory retraining. She was not terminated. Whether that was the correct outcome is a question that depends on what you believe the purpose of consequences is, whether it is punishment or correction. And Nathaniel Cross, when he read the summary, thought about it for a long time before deciding he did not have enough information to judge it either way. Gerald Frayne was issued a refund for the upgrade fee he had paid. He was not informed of the investigation's findings. He flew home from Chicago without knowing that the man whose seat he had occupied that morning had spent the flight acquiring a company worth $150 million, and that the acquisition had proceeded anyway, and that the only thing that had changed was that Harold Beck had made a mental note, stated to his new business partner over a handshake at the door of the restaurant, that Dana and Torres and every other employee of what was now a cross-capital portfolio company would be flying on a different airline going forward. That decision, across 47 employees and an annual travel budget of approximately $280,000, transferred to a competitor. Nathaniel did not announce this. He did not post about it. He updated the company travel policy, sent a brief note to his operations director explaining the change in vendor, and went back to work. Some decisions speak clearly enough on their own. This was one of them. 6 months later, Nathaniel Cross was invited to speak at the Emory Business School's annual Leadership and Practice lecture series. He had spoken there twice before, both times about deal structure and portfolio management, and the mechanics of value creation at the operating company level. Those talks had been well received. They had been, in retrospect, the version of himself that was easiest to deliver in that room. Technically excellent, strategically interesting, safely bounded. This time, he asked if he could talk about something else. He told the room of 240 MBA students, most of them talented, most of them ambitious, most of them moving through the world with a varying and largely unexamined degree of ease, about a 2-hour flight in a middle seat, about a gate agent's pleasant voice, about a briefcase and a term sheet and a phone call to Harold Beck at 35,000 feet, about a closing dinner where Harold had been standing at the door when Nathaniel arrived, which was a small thing and which Nathaniel had noticed and which he was choosing to tell them about, because small things were how you knew. He said, "The thing I want you to understand is not that I was wronged. You've all been wronged. Something unfair has happened to every person in this room and will happen to many of you again." He paused. "The thing I want you to understand is what you do with the energy of that moment, because you have a choice. You can spend it on rage, which is understandable and sometimes correct and almost always expensive, or you can spend it on clarity, on getting very precise about what actually happened and what it means and what the most useful response is." He paused again. "I sat in 32 billion and I called Harold Beck, not because I was righteous, because it was the most useful thing I could do with the next 2 hours." He looked out at the room. Your time is your only non-renewable resource. The question is never whether something cost you. The question is whether you spent it well. The room was quiet for a moment, the specific quiet of people receiving something they intend to keep. In the third row, a young woman was writing in her notebook with the focused speed of someone capturing something before it fades. In the fifth row, a man had set his pen down entirely and was just listening, the way people listen when what's being said is more important than the notes. Near the back, 2 students had stopped their side conversation and were looking at the front of the room. Not because they were supposed to, because they wanted to. Nathaniel answered 4 questions, shook hands with the dean, walked out through the Emory campus in the late afternoon, past the red brick buildings and the oak trees he had walked past as a student 17 years earlier, past the finance building where he'd studied until 2 in the morning, on the understanding that every hour was a compounding investment and that the difference between the life he wanted and the life that was available to him without effort was exactly the number of hours he was willing to spend. He walked to his car, got in, sat for a moment with his hands on the wheel before starting the engine, thought about his grandmother Celestine, who had lived in that house on 4th Avenue North for 40 years and intended to die in it, and did at 89, with her affairs in order and her mind intact, and her opinion about most things still sharp enough to cut. She had always said, "A settled mind does better work than an angry one." He started the car and drove back to the office.